election, I promise. But it's bye week, and there is no football this week. So, the election, not a bad thing to be talking about. And certainly baseball will be on our mind before the week is over. The Terps are playing basketball now, as are all the local college schools. So that has begun. But around here, it's a football town, Luke Jones, and it is bye week. And John Harbaugh has survived, as predicted here, and is holding press conferences and holding practices. And the team's 4-5, and the reality of this will set in when Cincinnati gets here, and that feels like a little while off, and we'll sit and watch Pittsburgh play on Thursday and Cincinnati this weekend as well. But the reality of whatever it's going to take to resuscitate this season begins with beating Cincinnati, and then the obvious, which is you better not lose to the Oakland Raiders. So if they can get this thing to 6-5, as I pointed out earlier in the week, you can sort of resuscitate this thing a little bit and try to find some energy. But that energy really needs to begin with some sort of different direction than what they've been doing, because what they've been doing over the first 9 weeks really hasn't been good enough, as we've pointed out.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at the first 4 weeks and say, well, that was good, but what we've seen since then has not been very good, and it hasn't been very good for a while. And it's been concerning because even though recently you could point to the injuries, that's only been the last couple games. I mean, what about before that? They were relatively healthy, much healthier than they've been in past seasons. So, as I wrote at WNST.net, it really feels like they're still trying to find an identity on offense. There's certainly things we can talk about with the defense, but I think a lot of that really has to do with today's game and a good defense, which the Ravens have a good defense. You can't be number one in the league in so many categories and near the top and not be good. It's just the difference is a good defense doesn't mean what it used to in the NFL.
Well, the good defense isn't 4-5 unless the offense is atrocious, and that hasn't been the case either.
But again, look at, and we've talked about this, so I'm repeating myself a little bit, but look at where New Orleans ranks offensively, look at where Carolina ranks offensively, and look at where Pittsburgh ranks offensively. The defense held each of those teams, I want to say, not Carolina, the other two, below their season average for scoring offense. So what does that mean? You need to score points in this league. You can't expect to win scoring 17 points. You can't expect to win with an offense that is averaging below 20 points per game since the Pittsburgh win back in Week 4. I mean, it just doesn't work. It's not 1998 anymore. Games aren't played like that on a regular basis anymore. And maybe they will someday, but
you mean that 12-9 game we had in Cleveland won't be the league mean?
Yeah, that is much more of an exception than it used to be. The reality is defense may win championships again one day, but I really don't think that's today's NFL. And a perfect example, just to give you a little context, that way we're not just talking about the Ravens. I looked it up last year. The number one defense in the NFL in terms of both scoring and yardage last year, the Minnesota Vikings. In their 2 playoff games, they gave up 62 points. So what does having a, quote, great defense really get you in today's game? I don't think very much. So my focus is much more on the offense. The defense needs to play better. There's no question about that. And when they play lesser offenses, they need to take care of business. But when you go up against teams that are high scoring, like Kansas City, like New Orleans, Carolina, Pittsburgh, like Atlanta in a few weeks, your offense better come to play because you're not going to shut down those opponents. So you have to score points, and that's where the Ravens, you look at this thing and say, can they get back to where they were the first half of the season, where they were pretty universally a top 10 offense. They weren't outstanding, but they were good. They were definitely good enough.
And there was also thought that the running game would come. You know what I mean? Like, even when it wasn't good the first couple of weeks, and Cincinnati was 4 days after the beginning of the year,
right.
They're down 3 touchdowns, we're like, look, they ran the ball last year. We believe this offensive line can be better this year. Right. They certainly have better receivers. Gee, Flacco looks healthy. He looks upright. Look at him throwing the ball. He looks like, he's 5 years younger. And here we are at the turn, and they haven't had any instance over 9 games where it's felt like their running game has been anything that we could even say, well, it got better or it's getting better or there's a sign of life. Nowhere other than when they throw Lamar Jackson out there, which is too much for my taste, but apparently this is what the owner wants. Apparently this is what the coach wants, and we're going to see more Lamar Jackson before all this is over with, and that's going to be part of their running game, right? Because they certainly don't want to throw the ball when he's out there. They're playing 10 on 11 with an inferior quarterback doing it that way.
Well, that's where, to me, some things have to change. Something's going to have to give with what they're doing there. And I will say this, they have run the ball more effectively, whether it's him running it or whether it's him running an RPO or doing his own read and handing off to the running back. I think the numbers do bear that out. Now, has it been outstanding? Have they averaged 6.5 yards per carry where it's overwhelming? No, but it has been better than what their running game has been with their, quote, traditional offense when it's just Joe Flacco out there. Couple things with that. One, they've got to figure out a way to run more effectively when it is just Joe Flacco out there. Well, on Sunday, and I believe I mentioned this to you again, but I think it's worth repeating because I think it speaks to the state of their offense right now. But over half of their runs on Sunday against Pittsburgh came with Lamar Jackson in the game, whether it was him running or him handing off to Gus Edwards or Alex Collins or whatever.
And they meant to do that.
Yeah, but that speaks to the fact that all of those other plays, I can't remember how many it was off the top of my head, all those other plays, they ran just 7 times, and that speaks to, well, when it's just Joe Flacco out there, they're throwing the ball. And it was 48 other offensive snaps. They ran the ball 7 times. And I think it just becomes much more predictable. We can talk about how it affects their rhythm, but you have to be able to run the ball when it's just Joe Flacco out there. You got to figure that out in some way, and maybe Ty Montgomery is going to help with that. Hope certainly bringing Ronnie Stanley back from injury will help. Not compared to not having him this last week. And I do wonder, because Orlando Brown Jr. has played pretty well at right tackle, do you consider making a change there and maybe you put James Hurst at left guard? Alex Lewis has struggled this year. I'm a big Alex Lewis guy, and it's tough that he has had injuries, but the PFF grade and what I've seen at times watching him, going back and watching games, it struggled. So maybe that's something they can do. Maybe they shuffle. Who knows? Maybe they put someone else at center. All options should be on the table, is my point. So they have to figure out a way to run the ball more effectively when it's just Joe Flacco out there, so they're not in a position where he's out there by himself for 48 snaps and he's throwing 42 of those times. And then on the flip side, if you are going to insist on having Lamar Jackson out there and perhaps even putting him out there a little bit more, you've got to have trust in him to throw the football a little bit more often because that becomes more predictable. And when you're predictable, that's not doing any favors to Joe Flacco or Lamar Jackson when they're lining up at quarterback. So I think they need to become a little more diverse in either of those alignments, and they have to be more productive, certainly, running the ball overall if this team's really going to get back to where they were in the month of September. And it's not as though they ran the ball effectively in September, but they were scoring points. That's the end game. And I think Lamar Jackson can help them in that process, but how they've continued to use him, and I think it's difficult to quantify what impact has that had on Joe Flacco and his rhythm. And we know Flacco has been a rhythm quarterback. He's been someone who responds well to up-tempo and has been kind of a hot and cold kind of passer. I think we've seen that for 11 years now. I don't think that's changing. So I think you have to take that into account, but I do understand the attraction in trying to get Jackson on the field, not just helping you right now, but let's call a spade a spade. There's a little bit more of an eye on the future at this point when you're 4-5 compared to if the Ravens were 7-2 right now. So I think there's a way to massage that part of the equation into it, but at the same time, you are still trying to win, and I don't expect them to completely hand over the reins to Lamar Jackson, nor should they until they're out of it. But you said it, they win the next 2 games, and I think they will. Especially A.J. Green looks like he's going to miss at least a couple games, so that would take him out of the equation, which is huge news for the Ravens as they try to get a little bit of revenge against the Bengals in a couple weeks. If they don't take care of the Oakland Raiders, then maybe John Harbaugh will get fired at that point. I mean, the Raiders are terrible. So I think they're going to win the next two. I think they're going to be 6-5, but then the trouble is going to start, and then that's where you really become concerned because you play 3 of your next 4 on the road, Atlanta, Kansas City, and the LA Chargers, and those are all 3 teams that I don't think the Ravens have proven they can beat those types of teams consistently. So, the next 2 weeks are the given. They have to have those. Then the real question is going to come going on the road again and seeing if this offense has truly made progress. But in the meantime, as they kind of go back to the laboratory, so to speak, for this bye week with primarily the coaching staff, as players will have some meetings. They're not going to practice. They're trying to give those guys some rest, considering how banged up they are, considering they had a longer preseason. But they need to figure this out, and I think it begins with the running game, and then it kind of goes from there as far as other tweaks you need to make across the board, really in all 3 phases, because even the special teams that we usually don't spend a lot of time talking about other than praising Justin Tucker, with the exception of what happened at the end of the Saints game. But they need to sharpen up their special teams because that area has been much more mediocre than it's been in the past. So needless to say, there's a lot of work to be done by John Harbaugh and his coaching staff over the next week or so before players get back and they start getting amped up, getting ready for Cincinnati.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore. Luke out on Twitter and attended the John Harbaugh press conference on Monday night that the screaming fans swore would never happen. They'll never let him back in the building. And look, it got kind of out of hand, I thought, in the locker room on Sunday with the questioning about it. And I know, look, it's our job to ask questions and stuff, but if not for one Ian Rappaport little nugget on the Sunday morning news, I don't know that Harbaugh's name and fired and bye week would have been entered. I certainly would not have started that rumor because I just never thought he was getting fired. But anything you want to say on the backside of that? Because I know on Sunday afternoon we're thinking, well, stranger things have happened. No one around there really believed Billick was getting fired, including Ozzie and Kevin Byrne and Eric DeCosta and everybody else that went to work that day, and Mike Pettin and anybody else that was in the building that day. They didn't think Brian was getting fired, but he was. So when it's John's time, no one else around there or around here will know. But I didn't think it would be during a bye week, and I know I wrote at length about this and I deflected a little bit on social media, but it's just not Steve Bisciotti's style to bring the news story to his desk election week on a 4-5 football team to make himself the story where he's pointing to whom the interim coach would be while every coach in the organization dives under their desk the next 8 weeks knowing their jobs are done. I don't think he wanted to create anything that felt lame duck before it's lame duck, because it's not lame duck. I mean, they go beat the Bengals, they go beat the Raiders, they're 6-5. And all of a sudden, the season's not over anymore. But right now it's over, right? It's over for now. It's over until further notice, right?
Yeah, I think the answer is John Harbaugh going to be retained at the end of the season? I think right now the answer would be no.
No.
I don't think that's being unfair to John. I think John would acknowledge that. And I think the way that he's handled these questions both after Sunday's game and on Monday afternoon reflect that, hey, John Harbaugh's not a dummy. He understands they haven't been good enough over the last 5 years. As much as we kind of think about these coaches having tunnel vision and they've got the blinders on and they're blocking out the outside world, how can you not acknowledge that it hasn't been good enough? He knows that. But that said, to your point, I do think some of the questioning being as sharp as it was is certainly a product of the NFL Network's report. I do think questions in general would have been there about making changes, but probably more so on, more focused on Marty Morningwig or shaking up who's calling plays or making player changes in terms of, do you cut somebody, do you bring someone up from the practice squad, do you reshuffle the offensive line, etc. Most of the focus came on him because of that report. But that said, when there is a report, and Ian Rappaport is very well plugged into the National Football League, you kind of have to ask about it. So it was awkward. There's no question about that. But as far as what you said and just giving my thoughts on it, beyond people being upset, and I understand people being upset. They've lost 4 out of 5. You lose to the Pittsburgh Steelers in Baltimore, that's a bad thing, and that's happened 2 years in a row now. But I keep coming back to what purpose would this have served to do it right now as opposed to the first week of January? And I've heard people say, well, you're going to have an empty stadium, and I laugh at that. No one's coming to a game because you fire a coach. They just aren't. It's the same thing we talked about during baseball season. And look, I absolutely thought the Orioles should have made a move. Whether if it wasn't Buck Showalter, then certainly a Scott Coolball or a Roger McDowell or whatever. But that said, that still wasn't making anyone go to games that wasn't going to games. I mean, I think that's laughable to think that has an impact on attendance. I just don't think it does. I think
the owner, when he stepped into the draft room that night, thought that Lamar Jackson would not quote unquote sell tickets, but make people want to come to the games. Sure, I think he still believes that. I mean, I literally believe that Steve Bisciotti played a relatively major hand in drafting Lamar Jackson to incite some sort of energy into this season that was above and beyond Joe Flacco, if Flacco's leg went out, with whatever. But sure. I really do believe that. And no one has told me that, but, I know enough to know that Steve Bisciotti wasn't in there saying, let's not draft a young quarterback that's going to run around that we can put into the offense. All of the conversations around that were the same conversations they were having in the hours after the draft, which is, by the time we get to Cincinnati the week after the bye, when we're 7-2, Lamar's going to be touching the ball 12 to 15 times a game, right? That's what they said in May, and here we are, and that's what they're saying in November, right?
Sure. And that's a little bit different because you're talking about a player. My point is, seeing people say they need to fire Harbaugh now or it's going to be an empty state. To me, the stadium's going to be empty because they're 4-5, and you don't have any faith that they're going to get back off the mat and make the playoffs. And if you feel that way, that's your right. I'm not saying people shouldn't feel that way. My point is that's not nearly a compelling enough reason for me to fire a coach who has been a really important member of your organization for a long time.
I know Bisciotti hears all that, though, right? Like, literally, all the groaning going out of the stadium on Sunday and the emptying out of the stadium. That's the thing. Bisciotti's talked at length about that. Like, that Packers game that year where nobody came, that he really takes that hard. He and in his press conferences, he's talked about fan mail and stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, dude, if you're on your own John Harbaugh Ravens Facebook Live feed, as I was on Monday, to see the horrific stuff that human beings will write about the football team, about the coach, on the team's threads, right? Like, if Steve is subjected to that, then, and still affected by that all these years later, shame on Steve, to your point, right? Firing John Harbaugh because fans are yelling. Fans are going to yell, and I don't know.
They're going to be yelling in Week 17 too. Is my
I don't know that Bisciotti's ever really adjusted all that well to the noise part of it. You know what I mean? Because he really is affected by it. It bothers him a lot. Keeps him up at night.
And I mean that's part of it. And I want to be very clear about this. Saying that John Harbaugh shouldn't be fired right now does not mean that I think John Harbaugh should keep his job forever or keep his job beyond 2018. I think the Ravens are heading towards changes. I mean, I really do, and I think that's probably what's going to be what's best. But I'm still looking at this thing right now, trying to look at it objectively and say, this is not a 1-8 team with a fractured locker room and a bunch of players that have quit on their coach, and there's not dissension between the head coach and the offensive coordinator, Cleveland.
And everybody believes they can go beat Cincinnati next week.
Right. It's stable. And now, stable doesn't mean good enough. And stable and stability and continuity, we've argued the value of that over the last 4 to 5 years. And I think it's gotten to a point where maybe continuity isn't all it's cracked up to be if you're just not good enough. And I think that's what the Ravens are kind of coming to an acceptance with. And I think we're going to see a change most likely at the end of the season. even, I mean, as I wrote at WNST.net, even though you absolutely acknowledge they're still very much in it mathematically for a playoff spot, I also think you have to be careful there in saying that aspiring to go 9-7 and essentially be the Buffalo Bills from a year ago, if that's all you're doing and then you're going to get waxed in the first round of the playoffs, I don't think that should buy Harbaugh or anyone another year just because that happens. Now, if you go 9-7 and then you make it all the way to the AFC Championship game, then that's a different conversation. But
then you get a Barry Trotz situation.
Right. But my point is, where they are right now, it's not as though things are crumbling from within in terms of dissension and quitting on coaches, and there being a lot of turmoil. There's turmoil because they're losing, and there's frustration about that, but I wouldn't call it an unstable situation. And I think, to me, the only reason you change coaches in the middle of a season, unless you feel you have a Sean McVay or a Kyle Shanahan on your staff ready to take over, and you're ready to make the change to Lamar Jackson, and he's ready to pop, and you're just ready to start a brand new chapter overnight, unless that scenario presents itself, and I don't think that's there, I really don't, then I don't see any purpose to making a change in the middle of a season when you're talking about a coach who has been as successful as he has. Now, has it been as successful since 2013? No, of course not. I've watched it just like everyone else, but I'll go back to a stat I threw out there for you, or a fact I threw out there for you in a previous conversation. Of all the head coaches to win Super Bowls in the NFL, one was fired in the middle of a season with that team for which he won, and that was Don McCafferty in 1972 when he refused to bench Johnny Unitas. And who was the owner of the Baltimore Colts? Robert Irsay in his first year. So that alone, to me, should make Steve Bisciotti not want to even consider making that change.
And there was no way he was sober that day.
Well, I mean, they wanted, the GM Thomas wanted to bench Unitas, and yeah, I mean, and that's a little
Stedman
more
wrote about that for a couple weeks.
Right, and that's a little more of an extreme example, but it does speak to how good organizations, winning organizations, teams that have won Super Bowls, they don't treat good people like this in the middle of a season. Now, again, this isn't saying John Harbaugh shouldn't be fired at the end of the year. I mean, if they go 8-8 and they keep John Harbaugh, I'm going to be very critical because I think it's time, and I think that shelf life has most likely run its course. But at the same time, he's done so much good work here, and it's funny. I even received this comment on. I posted my article on Monday evening, and a Facebook commenter made mention of, because I said that this is Harbaugh's last stand and he deserves it. And the comment was, or the question was, would you say he deserved this last stand if it was a coach for another team, or is he just Jeff Fisher with a Super Bowl win? And okay, I'll answer that question. I would say he deserves it. Good organizations don't fire quality people, and let's not treat winning a Super Bowl as though it's an inconsequential tiebreaker. Even if you want to take that away, which you can and you shouldn't, to compare John Harbaugh to Jeff Fisher, first of all, much better winning percentage, greater number of winning seasons, and far fewer seasons as a head coach. Jeff Fisher averaged a losing season every other year, and he was under 500 in each of his last 6 seasons as a head coach, split between Tennessee and the Rams. So even if we want to take into account John Harbaugh and the Ravens' mediocrity since that Super Bowl, he has 1 losing season. So it's a bad comparison, and to me it's not even close. If this were the Steelers or this were New England, or go down the list of any team that you consider a model organization right now, just in terms of success, they don't fire head coaches in the middle of the season. They rarely ever fire head coaches, period. And I think that's what speaks to the leash that Harbaugh has received over the last few years. And I think he earned that with the success that he had. So I have no problem with the Ravens approaching this the way that they have. If you want to say that they should have made a change at offensive coordinator, or maybe James Urban calls plays, or Greg Roman calls plays, and Marty takes a step back but remains with the coaching staff, I'll hear something like that. But to me, the last couple of years made it very clear that Harbaugh was tying himself to Morningwig when he didn't replace him at the end of 2016, and he didn't replace him at the bye week last year.
Well, let's be honest about the Harbaugh situation, right? That Harbaugh is never going to hire the next hot coordinator. Am I right or wrong about that? After having his pockets picked clean with Rex and Pagano and the guys early on, he is not necessarily open to having the next Sean McVay be his guy and roll out the door 2 years later. And part of that was the timing of all of this is that Harbaugh has been closer to getting fired than hired the last 4 years since Madison left, literally. So wanting to have guys that weren't trying to get his job was also important, but also knowing that if you groom someone, they're going to leave and you're going to have to replace them. That's a different thought, I think, for John Harbaugh in 2008 than it is for John Harbaugh in 2018.
Yeah, and I'll say this, and I think you're probably right. There's at least some merit to that idea, but it's probably going to contribute to his demise then, because it's great to say that you want to have continuity, but if you're not going to have continuity with a quality person, and look, I like Marty Morningwig as a guy, as a person. I'm amused by his press conferences, but I've been very underwhelmed by his tenure, his stint as Ravens offensive coordinator, and before that, quarterbacks coach. I think the body of work has been very unimpressive. So I think there's merit to what you just said, and I don't disagree with you, but I also think it's a fine line between wanting continuity and things just being comfortable. And I think that's kind of been a problem for this organization starting at the top, quite frankly, with the lack of changes that have been made over, say, the last 3 years. There wasn't going to be an overreaction after 13. I mean, that would have been insane the year after the Super Bowl. They went 8-8. They had some players depart. They had a couple injuries here and there. To me, that was a non-starter, even of a discussion about it. 14, they made the playoffs. When it started was after 2015, when they started out poorly. They had a ton of injuries. They went 5-11. That's when it really started to come. So over the last 3 years, I'll hear the argument that either Harbaugh or the organization in general hasn't been bold enough, hasn't been willing to make some changes, hasn't been willing to bring in, like you mentioned, maybe a young, dynamic kind of coordinator who conceivably would either get a job elsewhere or maybe take Harbaugh's job. So I understand. There are a lot of moving parts when you talk about the dynamics of any sports organization. But at the same time, you stick with Harbaugh has very clearly tied himself to Morningwig over the last couple of years, and it's probably going to be maybe not the deciding factor, but because again, I think some of this just runs its course. There's a shelf life. Bill Walsh talked about that. Brian Billick talked about that years ago, but I think that's certainly going to be a factor you look to because this team offensively has fallen well short for a number of years now, and John Harbaugh and his coaching staff, and probably Joe Flacco, and they're going to pay the price for it.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke at on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net. You can find us both out in the bye at Toyota.com. Audio of all talking Ravens during this bye. We will get to the Orioles, and at some point there's nothing to say about the Orioles, but there will be at some point. And when there is, we'll sit and talk about it. And I don't know that we're any closer to that than we were yesterday. Although I did pass the Brady Anderson tennis court, so I know Brady's been doing something here over the last 20 years. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. I am on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST, Tassel, Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore sports.